and that was the incidence of an epidemic that was called Spanish flu. Actually, it wasn't a flu at all, it was some kind of a fever, and it was brought about by the conditions in the trenches and on the battlefield, what with the decaying bodies and the lice that was got into your clothing, and the rats, and one thing or another. This epidemic of what they call flu started, and it was really serious. Men were going down like ninepins, some of them dying of it. And the reason I want to tell you about it was because in one way it affected me, because very soon members of the Royal Flying Corps of the different squadrons began to get this flu, and some of them, there were so many down with flu that they could hardly carry on. But our squadron, number 13, which is of course supposed to be unlucky, but our squadron seemed to be lucky. 13 didn't seem to apply. And we had very few men down with it, only the odd one or two. And there was a squadron that was about, well, it was near the town of St. Paul. It was further back than what we were, and they'd got about 50% of their men down with this flu. And so there was a shortage of different mechanics and such like, and they'd got no wireless men. All the wireless men were down with flu. So it was decided that some of those from the squadrons that weren't so badly affected would have to lend them men for the time being. So I was one I was sent back to this squadron near St. Paul. Well, the reason I mention it is because I'd only been there about a week when I got it. And I was sent into a Canadian hospital, a Canadian what they call CCS. That stands for Casualty Clearing Station. And I was in this Canadian hospital for about a fortnight at least before I could even get up and walk about, because it really knocked you down. But anyway, I did get better from it, but as soon as I was better, I was anxious to get back to my squadron, because of course I'd formed a friendship with a young fellow in the squadron, Bennett his name was, and I wanted to get back and be amongst my pals in the squadron. And the trouble was, very often they sent you to a convalescent camp to get over your attack of flu. And if you went to a convalescent camp, when you got better, they just sent you anywhere they thought fit, anywhere where men were wanted. And as I repeat, I wanted to get back to my pals, so when the nurse asked me about going to a convalescent camp, I said I didn't want to go. I wanted to go back to my squadron, so they let me go, and so I found my way back to the squadron. And this flu went on for quite a time after, but our squadron was still lucky. We never had many down with it, although at the finish, our sergeant, who'd been out in France since 1915, when the war was over, he went home and he caught it at home and died. Well, we'll now go back to the time when the war had ended, and I was going on for this 10-day to have a leave in Paris. And we'd got to the point where I was just leaving to go to Canberra station to pick up a train that would take me to Amiens. And that was on the way to Paris. Well, it was about 4 in the afternoon, I think, by the time the train came in. And I'm not quite sure, mind you. I know it was in sometime late afternoon or evening, something like that. But when the train came in, it was almost packed with French refugees who'd been forced back with the Germans, and now they were coming back to their homes. And of course they were coming back into every train that came in was loaded with these refugees coming back. But I managed to get a seat in this train. Mind you, they weren't as comfortable as English trains. They didn't have any cushions on the seats or anything like that. They were just burwood seats and burwood backs. But anyway, they were comfortable enough for us. We'd been used to roughing it. But we started out, and well, when you got on a train in France, you didn't know where you were going to land up, or how long it would take you to get there. Because with the destruction on the battlefields, and as the Germans had been retreating, they'd blown parts of the railway line up and done as much damage as they could, so that our engineers had to lay temporary rails, and they weren't very safe under the conditions of the ground, and evidently the trains had to go very slow. How slow, I don't know, but I know it took us a long time to get in a short distance. But I can remember that, of course, it was late in November by now, and it was getting cold too. And the next thing I can remember was the train stopped, and we were sat in this train and we were all cold, and the train showed no signs of moving. So we began to all the passengers began to get out, and we were right in the middle of the old battlefield. So we looked around to see if we could find any old wood, any branches off trees, if there were any trees left or anything like that. And we made fires by the side of the railway, and we were stood round these fires, keeping ourselves warm until the train started to move again. Well, eventually we landed up in Amiens. Well, Amiens was, it had always been behind the line, so once we got back to Amiens, we were more or less back to civilization again. But it had took us all night, and it was 11 o'clock the following morning even to get to Amiens. Well, it was only from Canberra to Amiens, wouldn't be much more than, I should think, about 40 miles. So it gives you some idea what happened when you got on a train in the battle area. Well, we were perishing cold by the time we got to Amiens, and I'd been in Amiens once when I first came out to France, just on half-day leave, and so I'd got to know the town. So I got off the train at Amiens. That was as far as that particular train went. I got off and I went up the street and found a cafe. And I remember going in and having a cup of what you call coffee cognac, which is coffee with brandy in it. and my word, you could feel it go down into your inside and warming you up. Well, when I'd had this cup of coffee, of course I went back to the station to get the train from there to Paris. Well, that wasn't long in coming in. I think we only had to wait about an hour, which wasn't long in those days, under those conditions. But eventually, when the train did come in, that also was crowded with ordinary civilians and soldiers, because it had come along from places outside the war area, and therefore it was more like a modern train, like you get in England, more comfortable. Well, it would be about 5 o'clock in the afternoon before we reached Paris. And when we got to Paris, and we got out of the train in the station, it was the Gare du Nord that we arrived in, and there was out waiting for us was about 4 military police, and they didn't want the troops to go out into Paris and get mixed up with some of these women in Paris, because it wasn't doing them any good. So they were there to direct us into safe places. And first, so there was charabancs outside, like coaches, but with no top on. So they guided us into these charabancs, which were outside, and in the one I got, they took us to the Canadian Leave Club. Well, the Canadian Leave Club was actually a posh hotel which the Canadian government had taken over for when their soldiers were on leave. Because when their soldiers were on leave, they couldn't go right back to Canada. They usually went back to either England, to London, or they'd go to Paris and have their leave there. So they'd taken over this club, and there was some vacancies in this particular club. The British, they also had a similar one, but not quite as posh, but that was full up. So luckily we got into this Canadian Leave Club. Well, when I looked in a mirror there and looked at myself, I was almost like a black man, because standing over these fires, as I told you about at night when we'd got off the train, the smoke had blackened all our faces. Of course, we'd no means of knowing that we were so dirty, and of course our boots were muddy, because when we got out of the train, we'd got all the mud on our boots again. So I was really surprised at my own appearance when I looked in the mirror in this hotel. Well, it took us up into our bedroom. I think there was 2 beds in the room that I was taken into, but so that there was another soldier in this room besides myself. And there were lovely beds, and everywhere was nice and clean, and we got chambermaids to look after us, and they came and made the beds in the morning and kept the rooms clean and did all kinds of odd jobs. One of the main things was, though, in the dining room where we had our meals, but I forgot to mention that the first thing I did when I got into into my room was to go and have a good bath, which was a thing I hadn't done for about 12 months. And but after I'd had the bath, we went down for tea, or diner, as it was. It wasn't tea. It was more like a dinner. And in this dining room, it was lovely. And there was an orchestra at one end, and while you were eating your meals, this orchestra was playing. And there was a big lounge, and in this lounge, that was nice too. There's tables and chairs, newspapers, books, gramophone, all sorts of things where you could pass your time away or just have a talk to some of the other fellas in the place. That gives you some idea of the hotel. By the way, the name of the hotel was the Hotel Dienna, and it was situated in the Avenue Dienna. And this wasn't very far from where the Eiffel Tower was. It was only about 100 yards from the River Seine, and of course the Eiffel Tower is on the banks of the River Seine, but it was just the other side of the river, and all we'd got to do was walk about 100 yards to a bridge and cross the bridge, and we were opposite the Eiffel Tower. While we were there, there was all kinds of entertainments and trips to view Paris and all that kind of thing, all to fill our time with. And there was also an interpreter supplied, and this interpreter, he was a man who took charge of all the entertainments and things like that while we were there. For instance, during the daytime, we'd go in one of these charabancs and he would take us to see different places of interest in Paris. We went into Notre Dame, for instance, the Catholic cathedral in Paris, and we went in various museums and Jardin de Luxembourg, which is no, it was the Jardin des Tuileries. That was it. One of the, that's like a park. And another day we went on the river. There was a riverboat, a lovely riverboat with and that took us down to the Palais de Versailles, or in English, the Versailles Palace. And that was the place where the kings of France used to live. And of course we were shown all the royal bedrooms. We went through the royal palace and the gardens and the surrounding that surrounded the palace. And of course the trip down the river itself, because Versailles is about the Palais de Versailles is about 4 or 5 miles from the centre of Paris, or from where we were anyway. So we had a lovely trip on this boat. And coming back at night, there was dancing, although I didn't do any dancing, but then in addition to that, to these trips that we had in the daytime, there was a big wheel in Paris, and I've never seen anything like that before, because it went up to, when you were on the top of the wheel, you were about 200 feet up, and there were like little cabins which held about 12 people, and as each cabin reached the floor, the ground, and the people who'd been round on this big wheel got out, and fresh ones got in. Of course, the wheel had to stop, and by the time you got to the top of the wheel, when the wheel stopped, you had a view of the whole of Paris from the air. But at night, and then at night time, we were taken to entertainments. The first one we went to was a well-known variety theatre, the Folies Bergère, it's called. and then we went to Grand Opera. Well, the Palladal Opera, where Grand Opera is produced. It's about one of the biggest places I've ever been to, and the biggest kind of theatre anyway. It was an enormous place, and of course it's known throughout the world because of its opera, and because there's opera on every night all the year round in this particular palais. And luckily, we couldn't understand what they were saying, what the artists were saying when they were singing. We couldn't understand the words, but we had a Canadian nurse with us this time. There was 2 or 3 of them came with us, and their job was to interpret what was going on. But I didn't. It was a bit. The opera itself was a bit too grand for me, because just a little bit too high class. I wasn't used to that sort of thing. But one thing that did strike me that I enjoyed was the orchestra. I'd never seen an orchestra so big before. There must have been over 100 instrumentalists in it, and I was interested just watching them play their instruments, and of course I enjoyed the music from them. And then another time we went to there was an English theatre where it was an English company that was on, and the plays were in English. So we went there one night and we enjoyed that. And each night we went to a different place, and we always had these interpreters with us so that we had no trouble getting about. Although we were that used to knocking about in France and finding our own way, that we would have found a way eventually, even if we'd been on our own, but it made it a lot easier having an interpreter. Well, it came to an end at last, 10 days, and when I went to inquire about how we were going to get back, which way we were going to go, because things were altering so much that just after the war we just didn't know where we were. So they said we had to go back to Rouen first, and then from Rouen we'd be sent to wherever our unit was. So we went on an ordinary passenger train to Rouen, and then when we got to Rouen, there was a camp just outside Rouen, as I've told you earlier on, when the same camp. I don't think it was the same camp that we went in when I first went out to France. It wasn't, no. But anyway, we landed up in this camp just outside Rouen, and we were stuck there for a day or two, and then it was back to the old cattle trucks, and we eventually got in these cattle trucks, and I was travelling back to the place where I'd left my squadron, or that was my idea when I was asked where my squadron was. I said it was in front of Cambrai, beyond Cambrai. So I was making for Cambrai station, and it was the usual thing. Slow travelling, you didn't know where you were. You were issued with some rations before you started out, and you had to exist on them until you got to your unit. Well, after about 3 days of travelling, 3 days and nights, place where we didn't know where we were. We eventually landed at Cambrai, and it suddenly struck me, because I'd been talking to other soldiers who were travelling along with me, and they said they'd received word that their units had moved while they were in Paris, while they were having their holiday in Paris. So it struck me that that the same thing might have happened to my squadron. So when the train landed in a station, it might stop there an hour or two. You never knew when it was going to go farther forward. So I got out of the train and I went to along to the office where one of our own people was had an office, and you could go and make inquiries from him. And so I asked him to phone the 17th Corps, which we were attached to. I knew how to get to it telephonically, and I gave him the number to get to 17th Corps and asked him if he'd ring through to find out if my squadron was still near. So he said, no, they've gone back to such and such a place. So I had to get back on the train, and I was another 2 days getting back to, of course this train was making a kind of a round trip, and my squadron, 13th Squadron, was moving back nearer to the coast, because they were one of the early squadrons. They'd come out to France early in 1915, and because they were one of the early squadrons, they were moving back to the coast so that they'd be one of the first to go back to England. Well, eventually I landed at this place where they were, and it would be about 30 miles from the coast. I can't remember the name of that place because I wasn't taking much interest now. And I found the squadron eventually, and in fact I was there for over Christmas and the New Year. And well, here we are, stuck on a squadron near the coast, waiting for the time when we would be shuttled over to England. Of course, there were so many troops coming down to the coast to come back to England that it was likely that we might even have to wait a month or two before our turn came to board one of the boats and get back to England and be demobilised. But just at this stage, something happened that altered those plans, especially as they related to myself. For instance, one day the sergeant came in and he said that they'd received orders that 2 of the wireless mechanics were required to go with the Army of Occupation. And as there was 5 of us, he didn't want to pick out any particular 2 and tell them that they had to go, so he suggested that our names were put in a hat, and the 2 names that came out would have to go and join the Army of Occupation. And my name came out along with another fella from Lancashire named Sammy Ledbetter. Well, we had another of these long journeys now, because we were given the name of a place where we expected to find a squadron that we had to join, and it was given as La Louvière. And to get to this place, La Louvière, we had to start off all over again on these railway journeys. But first of all, we had to go by train to Boulogne. And we stayed there overnight. By the way, we've been given 5 days' rations, so it gives us some idea that they knew we'd be knocking about for some time before we found the squadron that we were looking for. Well, after we'd stayed overnight at Boulogne, we went to the railway station at Boulogne, and again we entered one of these trains that was made up of cattle trucks, and we started off on our way to find La Louvière. Well, we were travelling again for days and days, and on the third day, at the end of the second day, we actually landed in La Louvière. Well, we got off the train and we went into the town and inquired where the provost marshal was, because they were the people who had control of troops who arrived in towns. And we went and inquired, and he told us that, he said he'd phone and find out where this La Louvière, where the squadron was. So he got through, and he came back and told us that there was no squadron at La Louvière, but he'd found out that this squadron that we were supposed to be joining was at a place called La Louvière, and that's how the mix-up had got going. And this La Louvière was right in the west of Belgium. So we stayed there for the night in the town of La Louvière, and I remember we were billeted in an empty house, and there was a lot more troops in who were on the move and were there for the night. And next morning we set off again, and we got to a place called Charleroi. It's actually spelled Charleroi, but the proper pronunciation is Charleroi. And this was a kind of a centre, just like Derby is, where kind of a junction where people coming in from different parts of the country would change and perhaps get onto another train to wherever they were going. And when we got to this station, the station itself was full of refugees, all travelling about, because this was a state of affairs for months after the war was over. And we were sat on the platform on a seat, and we saw 2 other Royal Flying Corps men nearby. So we went to them and got talking to them, and we found out they also were going up were being sent up to this squadron. They'd come from another squadron altogether. And one of them was a young fella. He hadn't been out in France long, only a matter of a few months, and he was only just 19. His name was Jim Penswick, and of course the other 2 fellas were older. Samuel Ledbetter was in his 30s, and this other fella was about near 30. So I naturally tended to get talking to the younger fella, and we became very firm pals, Jim Penswick and I. Well, we had to go to a place called Liège in Belgium first, and then from there we'd find a way to La Louveterre. And we were waiting for a train to come and take us to Liège, but none came that day. So we went in one of the waiting rooms in the station, and of course we always carried a blanket about with us, and we got down on the floor, and when we got in the waiting room, it was full of people, all sleeping on the floor, mostly civilians who were on the move and got stuck for the night. And we were there till next morning, till the train for Liège came in. And we went through, we left Charleroi and went through another big town. Now, what was the name of it? I can't. Sometimes these names escape me now, but I'd think of it in a minute. But it's you can't do that when you're recording. It was Namur, N-A-M-U-R, Namur. That was about halfway between Charleroi and Liège. We went through there and on to Liège. And when we got to Liège, we got off the train and we made inquiries, and we found out that the nearest railway station to La Louveterre was a place called Verviers. So we had to wait on the station until a train came in to take us to Verviers. And when we got to Verviers, we had to get off the train and inquire where the squadron was that we were going to. By the way, it was number 205 squadron. It was one of the latest squadrons in the Royal Flying Corps, one that had only been formed in 1918. And actually it was a long-range bombing squadron, but they were going to use it as a kind of a postal service. And so we inquired about this 205 squadron, and we found out that it was about 3 or 4 miles out from the town of Verviers, and there was trams ran out from Verviers for about a couple of miles, and then we had to walk the rest. Well, when we got off the tram, we found out that there was a big park, and we had to go into this park and walk across the park, and it was quite a big. It took us about 20 minutes to walk across the park to this big house. They call them chateaux, by the way. And we had to walk across to this big chateau, and when we got there we found that this big chateau was being used as the headquarters of the squadron, and it was very comfortable there because we were billeted in this place, and although we'd no beds to sleep on, but that didn't bother us at all. As I said before, we were used to carrying our blankets round with us, and as long as we could get down somewhere where it was dry and warm, that was sufficient. And we found this squadron they'd taken over a big plot of land in front of this chateau for an airfield, and we found out our job was to wire their aeroplanes up for wireless, because they hadn't got wireless on these planes, and they wanted them to be in wireless communication because what was happening was that they were going to form a chain from Cornwall in England, and they would send it would be used as a mail. They would send a mail from England to Cologne, which was the headquarters of the Army of Occupation, Cologne in Germany, of course. And this place, aerodrome that we was on, was the last one before going on to Cologne. There was two others in between. But they were both in France. And what happened was that because the aeroplanes still only had a limited range, they could only fly so far. One plane would start off in England and fly to an aerodrome in France, and then he'd land and he'd hand over the mail to the one in the next squadron, and so on until it would land at our squadron, and then from our squadron it would be taken on to Cologne. The thing was, they wanted to be in wireless touch with it all the time. So that was our job, was to wire them up and put the instruments in so that they could do that. And we didn't have a great deal of work to do, because we could get all the wiring and everything ready in the room that we had in the chateau. And we didn't have to do any parades or anything like that. The four of us who'd come up, the four wireless men who'd come up, had one room to ourselves, and we could sit on the floor and connect all the different parts together, ready for putting in the planes when they came. Now and again, we went into the town of Verviers in the evening, to have a look round and see what entertainment there was. And I remember one night, Jim Penswick and I went into Verviers, and we were walking down the street, and a young woman came to us, and she wanted to learn it. She was learning English, and she wanted to know if we'd go to her house and spend an hour or two helping her. And we did do. And she was quite a decent young woman. There was nothing wrong about it at all. But I can remember that part of it in Verviers. There wasn't much to comment on otherwise. It was a nice little town. It was very cold at this time. Of course, we were in the new year now, and it was very cold in January. And near to the chateau where we were billeted, there was a big forest, and there were Belgian workmen were cutting trees down in this forest, and some of the men who were working on the job, they had a little hut on the edge of the forest, and they used to be able to cut the branches off the trees and put them on a stove and make things nice and warm. And we were that cold, we used to go and stand by this stove to keep warm, because there was no heat on in the chateau. And I think that was about one of the... There wasn't much happened while we were there, really. The only thing that really happened was that we were so near to the border of Germany, I think it was about 4 miles or so, that I wanted to say, I didn't know whether we'd ever get any further up, and I wanted to be able to say I'd been in Germany. So one afternoon, when there was nothing doing, because we hadn't a lot to do, I took a walk, and went just over the border into, and there was a little town called Opon just over the border, and I remember I went in this little town and I was going to buy something to eat, but I found out they were that short of food, there was nothing to be bought. But, so I walked back home, but I was satisfied because I'd been in Germany. And then, as very often happened, word came through that they'd scrapped this idea of using the aeroplanes as mail and mail carriers, and there was nothing for us to do. So, but I know about this time it was nearly 12 months since I'd had a leave to England, and it was nearing this time that I was given leave, and I went on leave. I got as far as Liège, and then somebody had told me that there was an officer's leave train came through Liège every day, well, every night, in the evening it was. It came through from Cologne and went right through to Calais. So I waited in Liège, but when I got there and inquired about this officer's leave train, I was told that it didn't come into the station, that it just went through the goods yard portion of Liège station. So I went and waited there for it to come in, and when it did come in, it didn't stop to pick anybody up because it wasn't supposed to stop, but it had to slow down and stop temporarily because the signals were against it. It had to wait, say, about quarter of an hour before it could move on. Well, I went to this train and I found that all the doors were locked. I couldn't get in. But there was one of the windows of the door, of one of the doors was let down, and I climbed in through this window. And I just got down inside the train when an officer came up, and wanted to know what I was doing in there, why I'd come through and all this. So, of course, I spun him a good story about I was going on leave. I had no way of getting there otherwise, getting to the coast. So he allowed me to stay. And it was very comfortable on that train because there was it had evidently been an hospital train at one time. There was like places with stretchers up. And I remember lying on one of these stretchers and going to sleep as we travelled from Liège to Calais. When we got to Calais, we had to get off and go on the boat, and eventually landed at Dover. No, was it Dover?